All right, so today we're going to get into something called constitutional AI, and it's related to a buzzword you've probably seen all over social media called alignment. We're going to get into what alignment is, how constitutional AI is an emerging paradigm in how to achieve it, and why we think scale might be one of the biggest issues, and some cool things Kara is doing to try to solve that problem.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We love an AI buzzword. So specifically, I want to get into a kind of emerging idea about AI alignment. So I'm going to introduce the concept, and then we want to jump into something called constitutional AI. So when we talk about alignment, what people are generally talking about is getting AI to behave in ways that are sanctioned or often thought about as aligned to human values, which probably on a gut level, folks are like, that sounds good. But it turns out that that's super messy and difficult. Things like what values, who decides what's important, how do we actually make the model abide by them? And so this is something where I think the frontier labs have kind of talked about it, and alignment is a big word in the safety community. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to get into kind of this emerging idea of constitutional AI. And why it may be promising, but also especially in the frontier model context, it's probably insufficient to get to good AI in the first place. So, Kara, since I know this is something you are spending a lot of brain space on right now, can you talk a little bit about what constitutional AI is? And then I'll give a bit of a timeline of kind of where it came from.
Yeah, sure. So I think that in terms of constitutional AI being something that creates an artifact that is able to guide the behavior of AI without necessarily creating too many obstacles for it. There is like, how does this system remain fluid and dynamic? Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, and like thinking about it historically, there was a lot of structure in code, which was if this, then that. Mm-hmm. That's what it really came down to. How do we instruct code to perform a certain way? AI is a whole new kettle of fish, because what we're doing with it is we're giving it the opportunity to have access to all information, prioritize that information, and make decisions off the back of it. So it's no longer deterministic. Mm-hmm. It's working based on probability. That changes the game so significantly in the structures of how digital intelligence has worked historically. Mm-hmm. So it sort of was very much founded through reinforcement learning. Like that's where it had started. How do we actually create the possibility that these systems can learn and absorb the desires of the people that were training it, and create an opportunity to really hold and harness that in a way that's ethical and aligned to what the outcome that people were wanting. What I find so interesting is that it's very much been burgeoning ahead as part of conversations with Anthropic. Mm-hmm. Anthropic has been kind of the flag bearer for constitutional AI. They have released a few series, but probably the most famous one was Amanda Askell releasing a large sort of corpus on constitutional AI. I think it was in January this year.
It was January. It was like 80 pages.
Yeah.
It was really long.
And quite interesting. I'm not sure if you also got the download on the back end of the constitutional AI, like, because remember how there was that leak of Claude, and so it ended up in the system that you could actually download it and read into how they structured the Constitution.
And so something I want to point out that I thought was really interesting as an ethicist about this, and why I think it's both promising and hard, is so previously, like a lot of earlier alignment work was really rules-based. So from an ethics perspective, we would think of this as kind of a deontological approach, meaning like there's a rule and you don't violate it. But that tends to work well where there's a predictable set of outcomes, where people can operate within a set of rules that allows them relatively low flexibility to make decisions.
Can I stop you for 1 second? Yeah. Deontological?
Oh, it's a fancy, it's basically, within ethics, there's different schools of ethical thought. And like a deontological ethics approach is basically just rules-based. So the idea of saying, don't murder people because it's wrong. Mm-hmm. That would be preventing murder in a deontological fashion.
But if you had someone with a axe running after you and you're protecting somebody else, deontologically, you may be inclined to surrender the person because you don't want to lie.
Right. But as an example, in that, you might take if you have to, harm someone in self-defense, you might move to a consequentialist framework. So you decide what's right based on the outcome of the thing. And there's not a lot of concern for how you get there. So like the means are not really taken into account. It's the end. So there'd be consequentialist. Well, I don't want to die, so therefore I'm allowed to harm another person to prevent myself. But what I think is interesting about Anthropic's model is that it's moving from this kind of rules-based alignment approach to more of an underlying reasoning and decision-based approach. So when you look at the text of that corpus that was released, it actually is basically attempting to explain to Claude the underlying reasons or the underlying ethical decision-making about why it should or should not do something. And so this is interesting for a couple of reasons, but I am especially compelled because as someone at the Ethics Center, and what we actually focus on is ethical decision-making across domains, but the work I'm doing with AI is specifically to help people make decisions where rules are no longer sufficient to address the problems that are in front of them. And because we're in this kind of, blue ocean space where it's unpredictable technology, we don't know the risk space, that you cannot actually write a set of rules that guarantees that an algorithm behaves ethically or in an aligned fashion. There's a book called The Ethical Algorithm that came out in the 20-teens that I read back when it came out, and basically the contention, and if you look at all the research about this, you cannot code ethics into a model predictably. There are many methods to do that have been explored, but there's nothing that is seen as a slam dunk.
But I think that this is also the nature of AI.
Yes,
and I
absolutely.
think Yuval Noah Harari, and I'm going to bastardize the phrasing around this, but it's like what he says is that if you can predict the outcome, then by essence it is an AI, because ultimately what makes it intelligence is its ability to bring information, consider that, and come to a different outcome. And that different outcome may change based on circumstance, because that's what is like artificial intelligence. Otherwise, it's automation.
Yep.
And so I think the sort of really interesting challenge and why this is really important is because people have used digital systems for deterministic outputs for the entirety of how we've been using it. People are assuming the same level of fidelity when they're using artificial intelligence.
Which it doesn't have.
Structurally. And so it's, exactly, and I think anyone who's working inside the AI space, and so when people are like, can we 100% guarantee this doesn't create an issue or blah, 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 it's like, no, we can't. We can't guarantee that.
You can't.
Because you need to put in the frameworks and the structure, not just like you can have constitutional AI put in place to be able to hone it in. But this is why it's still so important to create the processes and workflows where humans are still very much involved inside that process. Yeah,
and I think your point there gets into a term that maybe folks haven't heard but is really important to be able to identify, which is this issue of what we call techno-solutionism. And so this is kind of an underlying assumed ideology where people assume that the solution to a problem is technical. And what you said is really important and subtly really powerful, which is certainly constitutional AI and reinforcement learning through human feedback. These techniques can be helpful in ensuring responsible or safe AI deployment, but they are not sufficient. That you need processes around them. You need human beings who are upskilled to be the human at the helm, to make decisions for which there are no rules. So a comprehensive governance system is by definition not just technical. And so that's something is that I don't want to throw constitutional AI out, but I think the way it's often positioned in the discussion is this will solve the alignment problem. Because in some ways, like, I don't want to make light of engineering by any means, but like, computers are not the hard part. Humans are the hard part. And so, yeah, just again, pointing to, I do think it's an interesting step forward. Another thing that, again, as an ethicist, I got really into is in the Constitution, it's also embracing a school of ethics that I would call virtue ethics. So this particular school of ethics kind of asks the question of what qualities make a good person. And I'm using person here in particular because there is a little subnote that I'm concerned about, which is the Anthropic Constitution was really the first kind of big document that created affordances to consider whether the model was conscious and whether it could be a moral patient. If you want to have a moral patiency, go back to Should We Be Kind to AI, where we talk about that. But that's really interesting to me because then the question of like, what kind of person should Claude be is a deeply terrifying question to me. I don't think it's conscious. But that's something is like the number of different ethical schools of thought and framework that are being built into this is complex and multiple. And I think multiple is good. Mm-hmm. But again, the question of it's still largely a group of very specific people in California that are ultimately making these decisions. Even if Anthropic did actually do some public consultation on this, like the whole world is using this model. And so is it appropriate for that tiny group of people to be making decisions about what values get baked into this? Like, I think that's hard, but
well, I think, can I say just for the briefest of seconds, because
telling you not to be a cynic.
No, absolutely. That's not what I was going to say. It's one of those things that a lot of the constitutional AI frameworks has come from, as I said, Amanda Askell. Amanda Askell was very much embedded inside like William McAskill, like that they were together, married, and so that William McAskill was the founder of the effective altruism movement. Yep. So it's how they see the world, and basically seeing the world through this like mathematical lens of what, and like I suppose it's an arching consequentialist lens. Mm-hmm. How do we achieve
effective altruism is a very it's actually a utilitarian consequentialist lens, which just side note, utilitarianism basically asks the question in aggregate, what produces the most good? So happiness, welfare, etc. If you're interested, like Peter Singer is perhaps one of the most famous ethicists. He's Australian. But so that utilitarian or consequentialist framing is very much animating the effective altruism movement.
And I think that's the thing, is that like when you're looking at how they're framing constitutional AI, it's very much along that line of consequentialism, but how that then replicates in the world, of which there is a rabbit warren of different implementations, is probably the level of concern. And, you know, we've spoken about, well, you know, how we create safer, more aligned AI, but what that means is, particularly if it's coming in a very blinkered view from a certain type of person and the way they see the world inside Silicon Valley, that it's structurally flawed. And I think a lot of people, and whether or not it is the best solution or not, right? Because obviously many people can have conversations regarding what ethics frameworks are going to be the best ones.
I mean, ethicists have been arguing about this for literally millennia.
And this is why I think it's so interesting that this whole like AI philosophy kind of hybrid is just this like really fruitful ground for interesting conversations inside this space. I think there's so much opportunity for us to kind of return to these deeper thoughts. But ultimately, those decisions are being made with a very few number of people with a very specific view of the world.
Totally. And I'm about to like pass you the volleyball for you to spike it, which is that I think one of the biggest challenges with what you've said, why it's a problem, is not actually that someone with a particular worldview is articulating values, because the reality is that everyone has a particular worldview in which they articulate values, but that these people, from a position of what I would think of as epistemic poverty, like the more privileged you are, the less aware you are of the problems people dissimilar to you face, right? So this is the idea of situated knowledge. It's not just that it's narrow or that it's often incomplete because of their privilege, but it is at such a scale of consequence. Mm-hmm. And so this is the setup is I am much more interested and think small scale deployment of this is much more defensible, interesting, helpful, and fruitful.
Do I agree?
Do you know anything about small language models and constitutional AI, Cara? Anything? No, but like I actually would like you to talk about that, because a lot of the problem comes from scale, and so a lot of the issues that we're talking about fall away when you're more intentional about the context.
But like, and this comes back to what use cases are effective for people as well. Like, and like, I want to make sure that when we're talking about things, values are reflective of the societies that you're in. Obviously that we have some kind of holistic views in the world. I mean, obviously don't.
I mean,
we're not like kind of.
International humanitarian law exists. Like there are generally global frameworks, but
what does that mean in the microcosm? How do people actually reflect what they want to do, or how they want their organizations to run, or how they want to think inside their world? That is what I think is a really good opportunity for small language models. And it's exactly what we were thinking about as we were going through the process of developing Selma. So Selma is a product that we are in the process of launching with 5 different pilots, which is very, very fun at the moment. We're working with organizations that have not only the specific legal requirements that they need to, obviously there's going to be legal requirements for different states or different jurisdictions, but also it's like, how does the AI reflect the values that you want to embed inside your organization? The thing that I find so interesting, and I'm going to take it like way back, was I remember when maybe about 18 months ago, there was a whole heap of conversations happening regarding what does large language models, like what do frontier models think about Australian communities? And so we were asking these models, like, okay, show us what a typical Australian looks like. And it was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl in a bikini at the beach. Okay, problematic, because obviously that's not necessarily Australian, but sure, okay, cool, that's what probabilistically comes through. Okay, what does a First Nations person look like? Truly horrifying. Right?
Yeah.
There was a whole heap of research inside this space, and so these models do not have the level of refinement that I think echo the values of our society. Not only just purely because they're racist and sexist and all the other things, because of the fact of the corpus that they've been trained on, but what does that nuance look like locally? And we are far more observant to those structures because we live locally, and having something that is a large language model means that the signal is mixed in with the noise. How do we actually structure and create this opportunity to have things that reflect our beliefs and how society works? So how constitutional AI can work inside a small language model is exactly what we're trying to develop with Selma.
Well, and I think this is so interesting because in my sense, even when we talk about, so at the Ethics Center, we often talk about you need to understand your values and your principles. So values is kind of what is good. So it could be justice or harmony or something. And then your principles is what is right. So how do you make decisions to achieve this good? And so much of that is contextual, right? So even the way that a value is understood. So you could say harmony. Harmony, on two ends of the spectrum could be about enforcing a high degree of social conformity, right? And that might be something that you tend to see more reflected in communalist kind of collectivist cultures, often like in Asia, for example. Now, a more Western individualistic version of harmony might encourage individual expression, but high levels of tolerance for variance of expression. Right? So both of those articulations could be considered harmony. And so I think that's why I just geek out on what you all are working on, because it gives you the ability to ask the really specific question, not of what is good in some broad, weird paternalistic having to make the decision for a bunch of people, but actually saying what is good here in our context, and why are we choosing that? How do we really intentionally articulate it and then build the technology that supports that? And to me, that is a much more appropriate way to do something, in the sense that, like, I don't think I should be setting other people's values without their consent, for example. And you can totally, sorry, I didn't mean to do it.
But you can totally see how that is how Silicon Valley sees the world, in just even looking at Mark Zuckerberg's recent revolting paper.
Like the 6,500 word gaslighting essay. Like,
but
do you think he believes it? Like, do you think he read it? Like,
it is, it's a wild journey, but I think it's one of those things that as we've gone through that, like processing that, and just the way that, okay, all of AI, and obviously how much do we trust Mark Zuckerberg with the future of AI? Sure. But
I mean, to be fair, not even on the safety, like I don't trust him with the future of a good business idea, but that's a whole separate issue.
But I think, in terms of like the framing around it is like, the purpose of AI is individual flourishing. which is so different culturally to so many different places around the world.
I mean, the word individual it's so in this like liberal enlightenment-based, like atomized individual human. It ignores, and obviously I'm reading all of, crip theory and disability justice stuff for my dissertation, but like the core foundation of crip theory is that humans are interdependent. Indigenous epistemology also accepts this. Collectivist cultures understand that an individual is embedded in a system or a network. And so to me, any ethical framework or any goal that is specified around the individual is wrong and doomed to fail because it's just not reflective of reality.
Well, it's not reflective of reality, but it's not reflective of, and like obviously what I'm trying to get to is cultural nuance. Is that the world that we want to see?
No.
And I think the majority of people would be like, yeah, no, we don't want to all live on islands where we like siphoned into the matrix and like that. That's
but like humans don't like
that.
Like humans who are isolated hate it. Like we are not constructed. First of all, we are not the only things, right? Like ecology and all of that matters. But like we cannot flourish individually. That is literally not a thing.
That is how evolutionarily we have established ourselves, is through collective action.
Right. And so, look, another reason Mark Zuckerberg's wrong. But again, I don't think
He's so cool.
That's like the meme I saw the other day that it was just like, why do we let people build friends for us who don't seem to like friends? Really confusing. But like, genuinely, but the thing for me is like, I haven't seen a version of this. So maybe if someone on the internet wants to send it to me, or maybe I will have another side quest if one of our producers doesn't shut me down, is like, what would it look like to actually write constitutional AI from a collectivist or an interdependent perspective?
But I don't think I don't think that's impossible. I think we can, and I'm going to reference back to what, those cultures exist.
Totally.
And so it's how do we actually learn from First Nations, Indigenous cultures, and understand the nature of stewardship, of collectivism. There are the frameworks that exist inside those cultures that can be leveraged in a way that is unique to individual groups and can be supported, but there is I think a deference that needs to happen to the nature of empire and empirical thinking.
Totally.
Does that.
And I think it goes back to another episode that we recorded about polycentric governance, is the way that I think about this, and this is just me kind of spitballing about what I would love to see, is like a constitutional AI framework that's built from kind of a collectivist, like an assumption of interdependence perspective. But then there are parts of that that are always up for space for kind of the community in which it's embedded to customize and to move to make sense to their local, I'll say, ecology. And I mean that in the broadest sense. It's their data structures, it's their organizational values, it's their collaboration norms, it's their legal restrictions, like all of those things. Is like, is there a base framework somewhere that is built from this collective perspective, but there's enough space for individual communities to self-determine exactly how that thing is implemented? Like that to me is a framework of where you get something that's net helpful and actually contributes to that flourishing, like uses AI in that way, but it rejects basically everything that the mainstream AI is doing.
But this is what I find really interesting. I'm going to reference a Professor Paul Tamber from Monash University, who works inside communities and mutuals. Is that not the whole structure of like communities and mutuals, and how do we actually create symbiotic, like it's not about creation to the individual, it's how do we work collectively to better outcome. It's not about restricting growth or abundance through that. It's like, how do we leverage the community? And I saw an amazing panel at the Social Impact Summit this year. It was Paul Tamber, the CEO, and I've gone blank on her name, but her first name is Melina, who is the head of the CEO of business of collectives and mutuals. Taking the products that have already been established in that space and identifying how the threads can lean back into AI is a really interesting kind of collective. I think that that's the future of how we see this happening. And we've got to take the learnings from that. And I'm not suggesting that everything has to be like communistic, but it's how do we actually learn and leverage learning across the system I can't see that happening any other way. And what we're being dealt with Silicon Valley is a very individualistic and specific, rampant capitalistic individualism.
And it's also, something I've been talking about in some of the research I've been doing is about what duty is owed to another person. And in this kind of so the Silicon Valley model is just extractive, it's one way kind of value creation. But one of the things I've been, thinking about as I think about, because I'm deep in disability theory, is what are the underlying assumptions is, in my case, an obligation that if I have an obligation to this person who cannot give anything back to me, I should still give the thing I'm able because it is good, but I don't assume that there's a transaction involved. But I do assume if everyone adopts that same principle across the network, something will accrue to me.
Yeah.
And so that's a really interesting ethical frame, because so often when we get to that atomized idea, or we try to articulate the ethical value in terms of equal value exchange or something, which when I'm doing partnerships, sure, I'm thinking in this kind of two-actor system, but the world doesn't work that way. And I wonder, as AI becomes infrastructure and we have more of these systems, if we actually step back and used a framework that was what does it look like, in my case, to kind of equalize care across a system, or what would that look like? It leads to very different ways of conceptualizing what's required. But so anyway, that's where I'm interested in constitutional AI, but I want to take us to one of what I think the failure modes is with this. To get back to your point about, Harari's contention that if you can predict it, it's not AI. So NIST, which is kind of in the US, one of the top bodies thinking about these issues, basically showed through some Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which is words that I read and I don't know anything about mathematically, just to be clear.
I'm sure that other people will not understand what those words mean.
You want to comment on that? That'd be great. But the point is they use advanced mathematics to show that a static document will essentially, at some unknown point, but with a probability of 100%, fail to constrain a probabilistic system with kind of evolving capabilities. And so in my sense, what I glean from that is not that we need to throw out the whole project of constitutional AI or considering the question of alignment, but we have to accept that any solution that we even think works now, we must assume that it has an unknown obsolescence period.
Yeah, and for me, that's not a question.
Right.
I think that's the assumption. And this is I
think that's true in the safety community. I don't think the average person understands that alignment is not a solvable problem.
But this is what. But I agree. But I think that this is what comes down to education and how we actually start at ground level in terms of what do we value inside society? How do we structure? And I think that a lot of people are transactional, and they're being taught to be transactional because of how education works. We have to kind of get back down to that root level and understand that through the focus on critical thinking, how we structure that kind of level of metacognition, understanding how we think, why we think the way that we think, and addressing that at a foundational level, that gives us more capability to see that this is systems theory. It's how do things work across the system. And I think that maybe people go, this is all intellectual kind of, but it's actually not. This is how things work in nature. Things are dynamic. This is the nature of the three-body problem. Things will impact upon, and this is me being a physics nerd, but
Wait, you're a nerd? Did anyone else notice that before?
But it's the kind of level of predictability as things are interacting with each other becomes infinite.
Right, and people hate hearing that the world's unpredictable. People are constantly searching for certainty and control, and my method is just let it go. But I think it goes back to this idea that the education that people have been given up to this point is completely inadequate for the world that we're now living in.
Can I tell you how I deal with this thought?
Yeah,
and I know that
I need more coping strategies. So definitely.
and I know our producer would just be like, "Oh, shut up," which is it's all going to end in the heat death anyway.
Yeah.
So it's pretty nihilistic and morbid. But realistically, it's like when you look at it from an intellectual perspective, it's all going to end in a heat death anyway, so don't worry about it.
You know what? I kind of love that. And here, no, this is so interesting. It's related to a conversation I have where I was talking about someone kind of in my community who has this very nihilistic approach. And I was like, I just feel like caring is so not trendy right now. And like, I care so much and I'm so earnest. And like, I just think I'm becoming more and more cringe in the current like nihilistic culture moment. So I hear that and I like don't know how I would do that.
No, but see, I tell you what, it's actually not that because,
Okay.
And I'm actually trying to be earnest. If nothing matters anyway, if like nihilism and heat death and this is what's going to happen.
Okay.
What could possibly be more important than actually living a life of respect and mutual dignity and creating opportunities for other people?
Oh, like that makes me so warm.
There is nothing more important than enjoyment, pleasure, like respect, like mutuality, kindness. Like those are the things that are more important, because if there's nothing else, then is that not more important? Why would you bestow a moment, an iota of time?
Wait, you're saying that if we're all going to die in the heat death of the universe, we shouldn't just get $300 million compounds in Hawaii?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Honestly, like I just can't imagine how I get joy out of that. But yeah, okay, I like this. All right, heat death equals being kind. I'm on board. No, but I think this is it. I think the criticality of going back and teaching people a systems analysis and a different way of thinking. Obviously, I'm very biased at the Ethics Center. We have a sister nonprofit called Primary Ethics, which teaches ethical thinking to primary school, kids across New South Wales. Is like we really believe that, we always say we try not to tell people what to think. We teach them how to think, and part of that is because they're the experts in their own context. And so they're the best place to make ethical or just good decisions. And so I think that's it. Going back to my point about rejecting techno-solutionism, is constitutional AI is a really interesting technical approach to try to solve some of these problems, but it is nowhere near sufficient. And my spicy idea that maybe this is what I'll try to slam dunk the episode on is I wish we treated critical thinking like it was a public health emergency. Like if we treated critical thinking skills, and I would say ethical thinking skills with my personal bias, as if it was a public health problem, I think we would get a really long way. So anyone in Canberra, call me. I'm happy to talk to you about it.
But I 100% agree. And like, I think ethical thinking is part of critical thinking. Like it's a thread in there.
But I think people assume critical thinking is this kind of logical, rational thing, and they think of ethics as something on the side, which I don't think it is.
Yeah,
but
I think it is, absolutely. And, you're singing to the choir there. But it was actually really interesting because I was having this conversation with somebody who was just finished their HSC. So just whatever it's called now. Sorry, HSC is what I've got in my mind because I'm old. But they've just finished their, high school education. And I was talking about critical thinking being a key skill that needs to be embedded. And so they kind of came back at me as to like what critical thinking is and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, loved the conversation because their understanding of critical thinking was problem identification. And I was like, that is really an interesting insight into how critical thinking is being addressed educationally and systemically. And this was a smart cookie or someone who was attending a child safety forum, and they were talking about this is how it's educated from a educational level. But they were like, the issue is that when we're talking about this, it's very much structured around problem identification and then solutions modules. I think that, again, that is not dealing with,
ambiguity,
what stakeholders involved, but also like, what are the longer term effects? What does that mean for, and it's so short term because it's trying to find a solution rather than sitting in the grey, which I think is probably the craft of critical thinking. It's not it's not coming with the idea that there is an easy solution, which I think is how it is trained, because ultimately there was this transactional kind of the past 80 years has been, how do we create this more transactional, stable world? Whereas the reality is not that. So having people be more confident and understanding how this works in a network is going to be such an important skill for people to learn.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like we keep coming back to a theme of like educational overhaul.
Yeah.
But I think that would be it. But what I would also say to folks listening is certainly you probably can't reform the school system. But if you're listening, especially if you're an adult, there are ways to learn these skills if you were not exposed to them. And so that would be kind of my call out to action at the end is think about systems thinking, about critical thinking, and what are the resources, who are you reading, what media you're consuming that helps you do that, helps you sit in the gray, and instead of immediately seeking a solution, actually sit and observe and think about the complex dynamics that you're trying to manage and accept that any solution is only ever going to be partial.
And then when it comes to how that reflects in AI, understanding that there are methodologies in place to try and replicate that, but they will never be a bridge. They'll never be there. So how do we actually create the systems that enable and show and evidence what the decisions the systems are making, but then giving us informed consent to, as humans that have greater depth of expertise inside those areas, how do we ensure that we are humans at the helm as part of that process?
Stay human, everybody.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?